Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Giselle Donnelly and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Joining me today are
Julia Joja with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities, and
Dalibor Rohac, also with AEI.
Our podcast is about the many challenges to European peace and security that have emerged along a line that runs from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, what we call the Eastern Front, and why these are important to the United States. Today, we're going to just talk, the three of us. It's been such an event-filled weekend since we last had an episode and since the three of us have closeted ourselves in these ways. So it's just us. I hope you enjoy the episode, and if you do, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much. We're going to start with something that's a little bit off azimuth for the Eastern Front, but we thought was certainly related in a variety of secondary but still important ways, and that's the brutal Hamas attack across Gaza into Israel and the mass casualties that have ensued and the chaos and the violence that have been sparked by that. I'll refrain from taking the moderator's prerogative to pontificate first. Dalibor, why don't you jump into the ring here first of all?
A few angles that we want to cover, but I would probably look at the big picture first in the U.S. and Western debate. It strikes me that there is almost this sort of symmetrical blind spot that our friends on the left have relative to our friends on the right, one with regard to Israel and the other one with regard to Ukraine. I mean, it has become almost impossible for many people on the conservative right in the United States to sort of articulate why the fight that Ukraine is leading is a just fight, and why it's an existential struggle, and why Ukraine is in the right. And similarly, I think one of the reminders that the events of this weekend provided us with is that similarly many people on the left seem to be congenitally unable to condemn violence and terrorism and mass atrocities. I mean, the number of people who have jumped immediately to sort of provide context and rationalize why Hamas did what it did, maybe animated by good intentions, but really diluted the sort of sense of moral clarity that we need. I mean, there is, the talk of whatever grievances Palestinians might have with the settlers or whatnot is just completely immaterial to what happened over the weekend. And those who sort of dilute the conversation with these, historic sort of excursions into what happened in 48 or whenever just are distracting our attention in a way that we would not find acceptable in any other situation. If it were the conversation that we would be otherwise having about the war in Ukraine, like if somebody was talking about language laws in Ukraine, it's just not a valid sort of contribution to the conversation that revolves around Russians massacring civilians. And in the same way, it's not a valid contribution to a debate about what Hamas did. And I think it really is important to sort of be able to sort of step back and look at the big picture, that Hamas is a sort of client organization of Iran, of other bad actors in the region, which I think, and this is important from our perspective, share the interest in destabilizing, eroding, destroying whatever is left of the rules-based international order. And I think it has to be sort of taken in that context, that if we are weak in Ukraine, if we are weak on Israel, it only encourages others to take the same path. And I think we have to sort of see this onslaught in different parts of the world as part of the same broad story, in which, I mean, the West and the United States doesn't seem to be stepping up in a way that the sort of circumstances call for, and we just need to do better.
Let me ask all of us to focus on your concluding point. It does seem to me that, yes, there are excesses of the left and the right, but there's also a weakness in the liberal center, if you will. These are sort of two sides of the same coin. It does seem to me that we used to believe that the arc of history bent inevitably in a liberal direction, and particularly that it wasn't necessary to use military power and traditional statecraft to ensure its continuance. So it seems to me like there is not only a need to sort of stand athwart the craziness at the extremes, but also to try to rally the base, as it were, to energize the vast majority of people who live safely and peacefully and prosperously under this.
And I suppose end the complacency of sorts. I mean, there is a sort of sense, like if you follow people who are friendly to the administration, is that, like everything that's being done is sort of framed in this progress in sort of small steps at the margin, navigating difficult trade-offs. Like there is almost a sort of Merkelian sense that there is no alternative to sort of clever technocrats, like making these little tweaks and, like now we have to make sure that Middle East doesn't get out of control, and we certainly don't want to escalate with Iran, and in the same way we want to like help Ukraine, but not too much so that Putin doesn't have a reason to escalate. And I think it's profoundly misguided, but it's also the case that it's sort of revelatory of the blind spots that these people have. And I think those blind spots would be better exposed perhaps in a less polarized political environment, and in a way we could sort of still have intelligent disagreements that are conducive to people learning as opposed to just shouting at each other. But that's probably subject for another podcast.
That's us sounding a little bit like we're all looking back at the good old times. But I want to add a couple of things here, and maybe that can bridge us to the broader transatlantic issues and then a little bit of Biden criticism, because we cannot do this episode without that, which will then help us navigate into the Eastern Front itself. But a couple of things to throw out there. The first one is what you, Dalibor, mentioned at the beginning, and I think it's worth underlining, and that is the common ideology, motivation that drives Hamas, has driven Hamas this weekend, and that we have a problem in the center, seeing clearly, and how that links exactly to Russia and to others beyond the hypotheticals and speculations of how Hamas trained and whether it was just Iran or also maybe Russia extending a hand. Beyond that, the fact is that people in Israel have been attacked in the most horrendous way ever seen in the history of Israel for the same reason that Putin invades Ukraine, because Israelis and Ukrainians are too Western. They love too much freedom and democracy, and that legitimates in one way or another, including by our center when they try to point to the two sides, these attacks in one way or another. Any sentence that starts with, I cannot justify the atrocities, however, and then talking about Western values in one form or another, to me already sounds all the alarm bells. And it is striking to me how it's not just a pundit here and there in the center that is supposed to have a clearer sight. It's not just the administration. It's entirely the Western, or most of the Western media, and how they're covering either what is happening in Israel and very much increasingly what is happening in Ukraine. And of course, that then drives us into the issue of fatigue here. Can we do one without doing the other?
Actually, I want to pick up on something that you just concluded before we transition. It does seem to me that both for the Russians and for Hamas, the barbarity is the point to a certain degree. It's both a means to terrorize and to achieve power, but there's just an animal urge there. And they know that it'll have the effect of intimidating Westerners who believe the world is run according to Robert's Rules of Order and the laws of war and civilized practices. Our inability to stare the evil in its face is a real weakness of ours and a powerful tool for which Hamas is clearly exploiting intentionally. And so are the Russians. There has been a cascade of stories throughout the war about Russian barbarities in Ukraine, and it doesn't register anymore. It doesn't make the news.
I don't want to sound like a preacher, but there is, I think, like in the views of many, something uncouth about framing, world affairs in terms of good versus evil, right? And it's always sort of more comforting to think of, all these complexities and, there's like history and all shades of gray. It's all very complicated. Like, you can't possibly understand what's going on unless you have at least a master's in Middle Eastern studies. And I think that is not working to, the West's advantage in this sort of mindset in our, in the pursuit of our long-term strategic interests, whether it's in Ukraine or the Middle East. And I'm dreading the day when, and the day might come sooner rather than later, when China realizes that this might be a good opportune moment to, do something. And despite all this sort of heralded bipartisan unity on China, I'm very much doubtful that anybody will be able to speak with any sort of moral clarity about, the status of Taiwan, or if anything happens in South Korea or wherever. I think the usual suspects will be sort of looking for ways out, for, reasons why this really isn't of any concern.
If I can add a couple of things that I think illustrate that, and then I promise we'll stop and transition. There's a video that went around this weekend of a singer or a group of singers in the Palestinian territories singing at a wedding. And the song is about how Putin should harden his heart and commit more atrocities so that the Palestinians can marry more Ukrainians, and call to China to invade Taiwan, because this will punch the Americans in the nose and will basically harden this perspective of the anti-Western common world ideology.
Before we move off this topic completely, I think it's worth addressing one practical argument that has been made, which is this notion that there is somehow a trade-off between helping Ukraine and helping Israel. So Josh Hawley, US Senator from Missouri, made this argument on Twitter today, saying that Israel is facing an existential threat, and as a result, any funding directed to Ukraine should be redirected to Israel immediately. I think those are his own words. And obviously, Senator Hawley is a demagogue and is acting in bad faith. But I wonder, especially Giselle, whether you think there might be any merit to the notion that there are trade-offs. So one story that I've heard over the weekend is that there is a stockpile of weapons in Israel which belongs to the United States. Apparently, in January, 300,000 155 millimeter shells have been sent from that stockpile to Ukraine. Is there anything that the Israelis might now find wanting because of these decisions? I mean, are there any margins at which we have to sort of think about, whether we engage here or there, or whether this is all nonsense, which is exploited for political gain?
Actually, there's a much greater overlap between the kinds of systems that would be required for a Taiwan contingency and the request that Israel has made, and the steps that we have taken to help sort of calm things in the region. To begin with an example to start with. So we have a very large carrier battle group in the Mediterranean. So that's actually our most modern aircraft carrier, and a half dozen large surface warships, and probably a couple of submarines. So that's moved into the Eastern Med. That's the kind of thing that would be useful in the Western Pacific. So to the degree that some things are tied down responding to the situation in Israel and the Middle East, and also there had been a formation of F-35 fighters, our most modern aircraft, that had been in the Middle East for some weeks and months, was in the process of being returned to the United States, but now has been turned back around to remain in the Middle East. And again, that's the sort of asset that would be in high demand for a China contingency. The Israelis own the skies over Gaza. They have lots and lots of ways to strike at targets in Gaza. So they don't need F-16s or ATACMS in the way that the Ukrainians do. And ironically enough, some of the other munitions that the Israelis have asked for is munitions for the Iron Dome air defense, point defense system, which are being lit off like the 4th of July every night to try to shoot down incoming rockets, not only from Gaza, but from southern Lebanon, from Hezbollah territory. So that was a false dichotomy to begin with. And if anything, the current situation underlines how false it was. And if you're the kind of person who thinks that you have to have 100% of everything for a China contingency, you would be more worried about what's being employed and what's being delivered or transferred to Israel rather than Ukraine. And I think your larger point is really the important one, is the United States, in order to behave as a global leader and a truly global power, has to be able to, this is the example that many of us have been warning about for years, that more than one thing might happen at once. God forbid that this crisis in the Middle East spirals into a larger conflict, but there are certainly a lot of, interested participants or potential participants on the sidelines looking to make mischief, put it mildly.
There seems to be this innate understanding now that no one dares to articulate in Washington, but yet it's almost becoming a given. The more people insist it's either China or Russia, it's either Ukraine or Israel, that we do not want to do more than one thing at the same time, because you would think that the Ukraine war, in the context of the threat or challenge from China, and now Israel, would be justification enough to increase military spending and increase the level of ambition of the United States, and determine a speech on both sides of the aisle to say we're now not anymore in a post-Cold War environment. Threats are coming from all sides, and so we need more ample defense. And within that, and I'm curious, as we're pivoting to Washington and then back to the Eastern Front, I'm curious what both of you think about the fact that I haven't seen it online yet. I've seen massive, from Saturday on, the entire world has been discussing the failure of Israeli intelligence on this, that permitted this to happen. And I'm sure this is an unfolding story. But what about US intelligence? Don't we have a responsibility, and don't we have eyes in there? How come we're not talking about that in the context of Biden hasn't made a speech yet on bipartisan support for Ukraine? And I haven't seen, except for concerns and statements of support from both the EU and the United States, I haven't seen any taking of responsibility and proposing a way forward so that these mistakes don't happen anymore. I don't see any reckoning on the Hill neither, by the way.
I'm not so worried about trying to parcel out the blame for the intelligence and leadership failures that led to this situation. But you brought up the fact, the president had announced last week that he was going to make a major Ukraine speech. It seems to me that the speech now has to go to a much broader, it must include Ukraine. But the only response that would help to stem the slide of support or confidence in American leadership would be exactly the sort of thing you're talking about. The willingness not only to assert diplomatic leadership, but to undertake a serious rearmament, so to be able to respond to simultaneous crises, without moving troops and, units around in this sort of shell game kind of a way. Biden really, he's sort of dilly-dallied throughout the Ukraine war, but now he's got a much larger challenge that I don't think he can cut in half or, address sequentially. And the task is probably exponentially greater than it was a week ago. Or maybe I'm overreacting.
It is a tricky situation because you would expect and want him to make, rhetorically at least, a compelling case for robust muscular internationalism, for the United States being ready to stand with Ukraine and help Israel and be sort of reliable partner. But it almost seems to me that he is not the best messenger for this, just by virtue of being who he is, and also that it comes at a political moment where, if he does make such a case, that might reflexively turn, a growing cohort of Republicans against such a message.
That may already have happened. Just think about this situation plus President Trump. The Republican Party has been haggling over whether to even keep the U.S. government open, for crying out loud. And it's got a hold on several hundred general officer promotions. I mean, it looks completely unserious. If that's not an opportunity for the responsible senior leadership, bipartisan leadership, to try to, put the crazy back in the can, I don't know what more you want. The situation certainly demands it.
And Dalib, we're both looking at you. If you can ease us in via Slovakia, our old home, and then into what we're looking forward to, if anything, in the Polish election.
So actually, as we were chatting over this past half an hour, the news transpired from Slovakia that in all likelihood Robert Fico will be the next prime minister, that he'll be forming a coalition government. So one of his sort of junior coalition partners announced that those are the coalition talks that they are now leading with Fico, and that they are not attempting to build any other alternative governing coalition. There was some residual uncertainty about this after the election. I don't think it's terribly surprising. I don't think it's hugely consequential domestically or internationally. It is very likely that Fico will now try to sort of extract some sort of a reward for, every time he'll have to support Russia sanctions or allow transit of weapons or lethal aid through Slovakia. It's very unlikely that he will kick out the NATO combat group, which is stationed in Slovakia. I don't think it's very likely. And he'll certainly have to throw some red meat to his base. He'll say no more lethal aid to Ukraine, while Slovakia has basically donated all our rusty MiGs and artillery pieces are already in Ukraine anyway. There's a munition factory in central Slovakia that's sort of churning out munition. I think, that production will continue. That would be sort of politically self-defeating.
And that's by contract anyway, and he would be killing jobs.
I think these people are very transactional. Like, as long as it's the EU or some NATO fund that pays for this, they have no quibbles arming the Ukrainians. So I'm, reasonably stoic about what this means for sort of Western unity. Poland, there are good reasons to be similarly stoic about what happens to Poland after the election on Saturday. That said, the election campaign has been singularly nasty, unpleasant, and Ukraine has been sort of dragged to the front line a couple of times, partly with the grain issue, partly with the sort of confrontation over, the sort of complicated past between Ukrainians and Poles, as a SS officer got invited to Canadian House of Commons. That obviously didn't go down well in Poland. But perhaps more seriously, it's also a polarized country in which the defense minister had no quibbles releasing decade-old defense plans for Poland, prepared by his predecessor, and using those as a sort of political prop, trying to make the argument that the previous government by Platforma was ready to give up half of Poland. I mean, it's a very irresponsible move on his part, piece of demagoguery, because these were different sort of contingency plans for a possible Russian invasion, and he sort of picked up on the worst case scenario and said that this was the plan of the Polish government all along under the previous government, and that's just, I don't think that's a sort of civilized way of making scoring political points. We saw the news this week of two top Polish generals, including the chief of general staff Raymond Andrzejczak, resigning, who's a very professional, very serious, very cerebral sort of figure. And I think that's a net loss for the Polish armed forces. We don't really know why they resigned, but my hunch is that it has to do with sort of what's happening in the sort of civilian and political side of the defense ministry. So that's not good news. I mean, we want Poland to be strong. We want Poles to have their act together, and I hope that that's what we'll get after October 15th.
I was going to say, a couple of weeks ago, there was a really impressive, huge demonstration in Warsaw in support of the opposition and, sort of with a we need to defend our democracy theme, which was very heartening. And Dalibor, I don't know, from a distance, Duda looks like somebody who is got a finger to the wind all the time. So, again, I'm trying to find a bit of a silver lining here.
I mean, in these opinion polls, I mean, it was a very, very impressive mobilization. So you had over 1 million people in Warsaw, and that's how it was sort of designed, like the march of 1 million hearts, as they called it. But when you look at the opinion polls, it's going to be close. If I were to make a bet, I would probably say that the incumbents are more likely to stay in power than not. They won't be able to govern alone, which, like, if you are worried about the health of Poland's democracy, it's very hard to make the argument that after this election they'll be able to do things that they have not been able to do for the past decade domestically, and attacks on the judiciary or media or whatnot. So I'm somewhat stoic about that. They will have to rely, they will either have to form a coalition government with Konfederacja, which is a sort of far-right, unhinged group, but I mean, it will make the coalition very fragile, or they will have to rely, form a minority government that will rely on some of these sort of fringe votes in parliament. Poland has had experience with that kind of governing in the late noughties. Government that lasted for a year, brought down by a sort of similarly unhinged fringe group, the League of Polish Families. I mean, he was Andrzej Leper, the leader of that movement, who, I mean, he killed himself later. He I think gave the world a flavor of what sort of, Matt Gates like politics would look like down the road.
If I can ask you a little bit about that. So basically, the polls are showing the party in power, Law and Justice, at around 35%, and then their main opposition, Civic Coalition, at about 30%. And then we have three major fringy, some more fringy than others, parties that would be enabling a coalition confederation, the one that you just mentioned, and then Third Way and the left. And so with that in mind, plus the resignations of the two top military earlier today, does that enable the possibility, unlike in Slovakia, of a coalition with the opposition party, with Civic Coalition, in a combination with another or two other parties that would basically shift the political landscape a little bit? Or is that less likely?
I mean, I would probably still, I wouldn't bet my money on it. It is possible that we'll see sort of last minute sort of moves in relative mobilization of the two camps. I have no idea about like how, good polling is in Poland. I'm, not an expert on that issue. My hunch just, is that like resignations of two generals are not going to quite cut it and sort of bring the sort of opposition in full force. I mean, but there might be other stories over the next 3 days coming from either side that would have the potential of sort of moving the outcome of the election. I mean, I think, it is going to be close. I mean, that's for sure.
Let me ask one more thing before we end this episode, and that is, with Slovakia, I think it's a legitimate question that we need to address, and I'm sure it won't be the first time, but with elections in Slovakia centered in a very negative way around Ukraine, and with elections in Poland that are not centered around Ukraine, but nevertheless, Law and Justice has brought it up in the context of the grain issue, grain ban. Are we looking at a reduction in the voice, in the loudness of the voice, the credibility, the legitimacy of this phenomenon that we've seen over the last 1.5 years, really historic here, of Central and Eastern Europe coming together and enforcing support for Ukraine, enforcing solidarity with Western allies? I would argue not just in Western Europe, but also in the United States. I think the voices of the Baltics and Poland and Slovakia in the early days really mattered, and Romania and others. And so are we seeing, with pundits enforcing that, likely in the next few months, going back to, Central and Eastern Europe, they're not mature democracies. They don't have their act together. Their support for Ukraine is self-undermining. And so that weakens the case for support for Ukraine overall?
I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation, all things considered. I mean, we are in a different phase of the war than we were a year ago, and people's attention spans are limited. And like the fact that the grain issue has been such a central feature of the Polish debate, and the sort of insistence that yes, we want to help Ukraine, insistence by PiS officials, the governing party, that yes, we want to help Ukraine, but not at the expense of our own interest, even though those interests were very parochial and very limited to a constituency that is critical for the Law and Justice Party, but I don't think in any meaningful sense translates into wider Polish national interest. So the fact that you've seen this in a place like Poland is worrying. In Slovakia, again, like I'm somewhat calm about what's coming, but it is pretty clear that helping Ukraine will not be a priority for the coming government. I mean, this coming government will not be proactively pushing Western allies to do more and step up. It will be reluctantly following the lead of others. And so I think the more stories of this kind you see in Central and Eastern Europe, the weaker indeed the region becomes.
The Polish government would only be following the Autobahn on which the German government finds itself. Chancellor Scholz has given us another instance of Scholzing with his Hamlet-like decision or non-decision making on the Taurus cruise missiles. He's clearly waiting for President Biden to make up his mind about the U.S. ATACMS system. So, once again, we find ourselves in a situation that Europeans will be reluctant to step out in front of an American-led alliance. So with that happy note, let us conclude. So from me, Giselle Donnelly, and my colleagues Dalibor Rohach and Yulia Zhozha, thank you so much for joining us on the Eastern Front. Our podcast is dedicated to the security challenges that have arisen along a line from the Baltic to the Black Sea. You can find more episodes of the Eastern Front and additional content on our website, aei.org, or on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Do be in touch with us on the artist formerly known as Twitter, using the hashtag EasternFrontPod as one word. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Until next time, thank you.